Sometimes the strongest heartbeat is the one no one believes can hear you. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, washing the stone towers of Blackwood Keep in silver ribbons that blurred the line between earth and sky. Inside the royal infirmary, every window remained shuttered, every candle burned low, and every whispered conversation ended with the same hopeless silence. Their Alpha King had returned from the northern frontier alive, yet he had not opened his eyes once in nearly 12 months. The greatest healers from every allied territory had come and gone, leaving behind polished instruments, expensive remedies, and promises that dissolved into disappointment. In the end, only one person remained willing to tend to him each day. Claire Whitmore carried a wooden basin filled with warm water across the quiet room, careful not to spill a single drop. At 23, she had long ago accepted that being an Omega meant people often overlooked her, especially inside a palace where strength was admired above kindness. She quietly folded a clean linen cloth, dipped into the steaming water, and gently cleaned the fading scars that crossed the king's shoulder. His breathing remained slow and even, untouched by the world around him. "Good morning," she whispered with a small smile that no one else ever saw. "The rain finally reached the rose garden today. I think the flowers will survive after all." No answer came. It never did. Still, she continued as though speaking to an old friend resting after an exhausting journey. She told him about the sparrows nesting beneath the eastern roof, about the elderly cook who secretly baked cinnamon bread every Sunday morning, and about the palace gardener who insisted roses responded better to songs than sunshine. Every story was ordinary. Every word was gentle. Every visit lasted almost exactly 1 hour. When she finished cleaning his wounds, she carefully replaced the fresh bandages and straightened the heavy blanket across his chest. Outside the room, footsteps echoed before 2 royal attendants appeared in the doorway. "You're still talking to him?" one asked with a tired laugh. "He can't hear a single word." Claire lowered her eyes politely. "Maybe not," she answered softly. "But I think people deserve kindness even when they can't answer back." The attendants exchanged amused glances before disappearing down the hallway, convinced the quiet Omega was wasting another morning on a king who would never awaken. Claire waited until their voices faded before pulling a chair beside the bed. She rested her hands in her lap and looked toward the gray light filtering through the curtains. "You know," she murmured, "I wasn't very brave growing up. I used to think silence meant loneliness. Then I realized silence can also mean someone is still fighting a battle we simply cannot see." She laughed quietly at herself and shook her head. "Listen to me. I'm telling stories again. Maybe one day you'll wake up and wonder who kept talking all year." The room remained perfectly still. The candles flickered once as the wind brushed against the stone walls. Claire smiled anyway, rose to collect the empty basin, and walked toward the door without noticing the faintest movement beneath the blanket, a single finger trembling for the briefest heartbeat before becoming perfectly still once more. Morning after morning, Claire Whitmore followed the same quiet path through the long stone corridors before the rest of the palace fully awakened. The guards barely looked at her anymore. The servants nodded politely, without slowing their work. To everyone else, she had become another ordinary part of the castle, as familiar as the candles that were replaced every sunrise or the clock that echoed across the western tower every hour. She welcomed the routine because routines asked nothing from her except patience. She carried fresh water, clean linen, fragrant herbs, and the small leather journal where she kept track of the king's temperature, breathing, and the gradual fading of old scars. Although the royal physicians rarely read her notes, she continued writing them with careful handwriting because it felt wrong to stop believing that every small improvement mattered. As she gently adjusted the blankets one cool autumn morning, she noticed the sunlight reaching farther across the floor than it had only a week before. Summer had quietly surrendered to fall. "You missed another season," she said with a warm smile. "The maple trees outside your window are turning bright red. I wish you could see them. They make the whole courtyard look like it is glowing." She paused for a moment before laughing softly. "I suppose I will have to describe everything until you decide to wake up." There was no answer except the steady rhythm of his breathing. That never discouraged her. Instead, she spoke about ordinary things that no royal advisor would ever consider important. She described the baker who accidentally burned an entire batch of apple pies because he was humming too loudly. She talked about the stable boy who had finally earned the trust of a frightened colt after weeks of quiet visits. She admitted that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher because she loved watching frightened people discover confidence, one small step at a time. Some afternoons, she confessed fears she had never shared with another soul. "I wonder if people remember kindness," she whispered while replacing a bandage. "Everyone remembers victories and failures, but kindness disappears so easily. Maybe that is all right. Maybe it is enough that someone feels less alone for a little while." Outside the room, the palace continued its endless rhythm of meetings, ceremonies, and political debates, yet inside those walls time seemed gentler, measured not by royal decrees, but by quiet conversations offered without expectation. Even the older nurses eventually stopped asking why she continued talking. They simply smiled with sympathy, believing the lonely Omega had found comfort in speaking to silence. Winter arrived earlier than expected, frosting every window with delicate white patterns. Claire lit the fireplace before beginning her work, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. "You would laugh if you saw me now," she said. "I cannot even keep my nose warm. I think winter enjoys reminding us that we are all smaller than we imagine." She carefully brushed a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear before checking his pulse once more. Stronger, she thought. Just a little stronger than yesterday. It was. Probably wishful thinking, but hope had become a habit she refused to abandon. As she gathered the empty basin and prepared to leave, she gently rested her hand over his for only a heartbeat. "Good night, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Tomorrow I will tell you another story." She slipped quietly through the doorway, never seeing the almost invisible change in the still face behind her, nor knowing that somewhere beneath the silence, every word she had spoken continued to shine like distant stars guiding someone through an endless night. The palace had long since stopped seeing Claire Whitmore as a person and had begun treating her like another piece of furniture inside the royal infirmary. She arrived before sunrise, left after dusk, and quietly disappeared between those hours without asking for recognition. Some servants greeted her kindly, but most barely remembered her name. To the nobles, she was simply the Omega assigned to an impossible task, a gentle soul wasting precious months, caring for a king who might never rise again. During council meetings, powerful voices echoed through marble halls filled with polished banners and towering windows. Generals debated border security. Advisors argued over taxes and alliances. Merchants petitioned for royal favors. Yet whenever someone mentioned the king's condition, the conversation always ended the same way. "Nothing has changed," they would say before moving on to more important matters. Claire heard those words more often than anyone realized. Carrying clean bandages through the corridors one afternoon, she paused outside the council chamber as two noble women stepped into the hallway. "That Omega still speaks to him every day," one said with a quiet laugh. "She probably believes fairy tales can wake a sleeping king." The other smiled politely. "Hope is harmless. It keeps simple people busy." Claire lowered her eyes and continued walking without a single reply. She had learned long ago that defending herself only invited longer conversations she never wanted to have. Inside the infirmary, the silence welcomed her like an old friend. She refreshed the flowers beside the window, replaced yesterday's water with fresh spring water, and carefully adjusted the curtains so the afternoon sunlight rested gently across Adrian Blackwood's bed instead of shining directly into his face. "You should know something," she said while folding another clean cloth. "The palace feels louder every day, but this room never does. I think that is why I like being here." She smiled faintly before continuing her work. "Everyone outside seems determined to prove they are important. You never ask for anything." She checked his breathing, then carefully smoothed the blanket across his shoulders. Perhaps silence teaches better manners than power. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Edmund, the oldest physician in the castle, entered carrying a polished wooden case filled with herbal medicines. Unlike many others, he never mocked Claire's devotion. Instead, he quietly studied the king before giving a thoughtful nod. His fever has not returned, he observed. Claire looked up with cautious hope. I noticed the same thing yesterday. The elderly doctor smiled gently. Continue exactly as you have been. Before leaving, he hesitated near the doorway. Young lady, there are many kinds of healing. Most people only recognize the ones they can measure. His words lingered in the room long after he disappeared down the hallway. That evening, heavy snow drifted beyond the windows, covering the palace gardens in soft white silence. Claire lit another candle and settled into her familiar chair. Dr. Edmund believes I am helping, she whispered with an embarrassed laugh. I hope he is right because sometimes I wonder whether I am only talking to keep myself company. She rested her folded hands in her lap and gazed at the peaceful face before her. Still, if you can hear even the smallest piece of this, then I want you to know something. No crown should carry every burden alone. Even kings deserve someone who simply stays. She rose quietly, believing her words would vanish into another silent night, never realizing that behind closed eyes and perfect stillness, every sentence found its place inside a waiting heart that had forgotten neither her voice nor her unwavering kindness. Spring arrived so quietly that Claire Whitmore almost missed the first signs of it. The snow disappeared from the palace gardens, the fountains flowed again, and fresh green vines slowly climbed the old stone walls beneath the eastern tower. Nearly a full year had passed since she first stepped into the royal infirmary carrying nothing but clean water and uncertain hope. The seasons had changed around them, yet her routine remained beautifully unchanged. Every morning she opened the windows to welcome fresh air, replaced the flowers beside Adrian Blackwood's bed, changed his bandages with careful hands, and filled the room with stories that expected nothing in return. She spoke about birds building nests beneath the castle roof, children laughing in the village square beyond the palace gates, and the tiny blue wildflowers that always bloomed first along the forest trail after winter faded away. Sometimes she read aloud from old history books because she imagined a king should never fall behind on the stories of his own kingdom. Other days, she simply sat beside him in comfortable silence, believing that even silence could be shared. What Claire never knew was that beyond the stillness of his sleeping body, another world had never truly fallen silent. Adrian could not move. He could not open his eyes. He could not lift a single finger or speak a single word. Yet somewhere deep inside the endless darkness surrounding his thoughts, one voice reached him every single day. He learned the rhythm of her footsteps before she entered the room. He recognized the soft sound of porcelain as she placed a cup of warm tea on the nearby table, even though she was always the only one who drank it. He could almost tell the weather by the brightness in her voice alone. Rain made her thoughtful. Sunshine made her laugh more often. Snow always reminded her of childhood memories she shared without realizing anyone was listening. When loneliness crept into her heart, she never complained. She simply spoke a little softer. Adrian held on to every word because they became the only measure of time he still possessed. One afternoon, Claire smiled as she gently adjusted the blanket across his shoulders. I have decided something, she said. When you wake up one day, I hope nobody overwhelms you with meetings or ceremonies. I hope someone lets you walk through the gardens first. The roses have waited long enough to meet their king again. Deep inside the silence, Adrian wanted desperately to answer that he remembered exactly where the roses grew because she had described every path, every blossom, and every sunrise so carefully that he could almost see them. But nothing happened. His body refused every command. Even so, something had changed. For the first time in many months, he felt warmth spread through the fingers of his right hand. It was faint, lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but it was real. Claire happened to be looking toward the window, watching two robins land beside the fountain outside. She never noticed the smallest movement beneath the blanket. By the time she looked back, complete stillness had returned. She smiled gently, believing the day had passed like every other day before it. Adrian remained trapped behind closed eyes, carrying a secret that no physician, no advisor, and not even the faithful Omega sitting beside him could yet imagine. He had never been alone inside the darkness because her voice had become the light that guided him through every endless day, and he silently promised himself that if the morning ever came when he could finally open his eyes, the very first thing he would search for would not be his crown, his throne, or his kingdom. It would be the quiet woman who had unknowingly taught a silent king how hope truly sounded. The first warm breeze of early summer drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming lavender into the quiet chamber. Claire Whitmore smiled as she placed a new vase of white lilies beside Adrian Blackwood's bed. "You always seemed like someone who would prefer simple flowers," she said softly. "The gardeners keep asking whether they should bring the royal orchids instead, but I think these suit the room much better." She adjusted the blanket one last time before reaching for her journal, only to pause when hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A young palace. Messenger stopped outside the door, breathing heavily after climbing the castle stairs. "Miss Whitmore," he said respectfully, "Dr. Edmund has asked to see you immediately." Claire nodded, leaving the journal on the table before quietly following him through the winding halls. Dr. Edmund stood inside the old library with several members of the royal council waiting nearby. Their expressions were polite but distant. The elderly physician folded his hands together before speaking. "Claire, you have served faithfully for nearly a year. No one questions your dedication." One of the advisors stepped forward. "The council has decided to bring in a delegation of renowned healers from overseas. They require complete control of the royal infirmary during their treatment. Effective tomorrow morning, your duties will end." Claire remained silent for several moments before offering the smallest smile. If there is even a chance they can help His Majesty recover, then they should have that chance. Dr. Edmund watched her carefully. "You are not angry?" She gently shook her head. "I never came here to be important. I only hoped he would get better." The council members seemed almost surprised by her answer. One signed the official document while another thanked her for her service with practiced formality. The meeting ended as quickly as it had begun. Claire returned to the infirmary carrying the quiet weight of goodbye in her heart. The room looked exactly as it always had. Afternoon sunlight rested across the floor, the lilies stood beside the window, and Adrian remained peacefully still. She slowly completed each familiar task, replacing the bandages with the same careful hands that had never once rushed through their work. When everything was finished, she pulled her chair closer to the bed and folded her hands together. "It looks like today is my last day here," she whispered with a gentle laugh that carried more sadness than humor. "I suppose someone else will tell you stories tomorrow." Her eyes drifted toward the bright garden outside. "I hope they remember to open the windows every morning because you always seem to breathe easier when fresh air filled the room." She hesitated before continuing. "And I hope they describe the seasons to you. Autumn is still my favorite, but I think you would probably choose spring." A quiet silence settled between them. Claire reached into her pocket and removed a narrow blue ribbon that had once held her journal closed before tying it carefully around the handle of the small vase. "This is only so the flowers look a little brighter," she murmured. "I know you cannot see them yet, but perhaps one day you will." She stood slowly and rested her fingertips lightly against the edge of the blanket instead of his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You never answered a single question, but somehow speaking with you helped me become a little braver than I used to be. I truly hope you wake up one morning surrounded by people who remind you that you were loved long before you opened your eyes." With one final smile, Claire picked up her empty bag and quietly walked toward the door without looking back. The soft click of the closing door echoed through the silent room. Moments later, for the first time in almost a year, Adrian felt something he had feared would never come again. The sound of her footsteps faded beyond his reach, and the darkness surrounding him suddenly felt colder than it ever had before. The following morning, the Royal Infirmary felt unfamiliar for the very first time. New physicians filled the room with polished instruments, fresh medicines, and confident voices. They checked charts, measured breathing, compared observations, and discussed treatments with careful precision. Yet something invisible had vanished. The windows remained closed despite the warm breeze outside. No fresh flowers stood beside the bed. No quiet voice greeted the silent king with stories about ordinary life beyond the palace walls. Hour after hour passed beneath perfect professional care, but the room itself seemed strangely empty. Somewhere inside the endless darkness, Adrian Blackwood searched for the one sound that had marked every morning for almost a year. He waited for the familiar footsteps that always paused briefly before reaching his bedside. He waited for the gentle greeting that always arrived before the first bandage was changed. He waited for Claire Whitmore to describe another sunrise he could not yet see. Only silence answered him. For the first time since his long sleep had begun, fear found him. Not fear for his kingdom, nor for his crown, but fear that the voice which had carried him through endless seasons had disappeared forever. He tried again to command his body to move. Every effort felt like pushing against an enormous locked gate. Nothing happened. The hours stretched endlessly until evening settled over Blackwood Keep. The new healers quietly left one by one, convinced another uneventful day had passed. Moonlight slipped through a narrow opening in the curtains, touching the blue ribbon still tied around the small flower vase beside his bed. Although the lilies had begun to fade, the ribbon remained exactly where Claire had left it. Somewhere deep inside Adrian's memory, her final words echoed with perfect clarity. "You were loved long before you opened your eyes." The sentence repeated itself again and again until it became stronger than the silence surrounding him. Then, almost without warning, something changed. A deep breath filled his lungs more fully than it had in months. His fingers twitched once. Then again. His heartbeat quickened. His eyelids trembled beneath the candlelight. Outside the room, a passing guard stopped walking, certain he had imagined what he saw through the partially open door. The guard hurried away to summon Dr. Edmund. Within moments, hurried footsteps filled the corridor once more. The elderly physician entered first, followed by startled attendants who froze where they stood. Adrian's breathing had changed. His hands moved slightly against the blanket. Dr. Edmund stepped closer, hardly daring to believe his own eyes. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "can you hear me?" Slowly, painfully, Adrian opened his eyes. Bright candlelight forced him to blink as the unfamiliar room came into focus after so many silent seasons. Every face surrounding him wore expressions of astonishment and relief, yet he barely noticed any of them. His gaze drifted immediately toward the empty chair beside the bed. It was exactly where Claire had always sat. The flowers remained. The blue ribbon remained. She did not. His voice was rough from disuse, almost no louder than a whisper, but every person in the room heard the first words their king spoke after nearly a year of silence. "Where is Claire Whitmore?" The attendants exchanged confused glances. One advisor stepped forward eagerly. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council is assembled and awaiting your orders." Adrian slowly turned his eyes toward him with calm certainty. "I did not ask for my counsel." The room fell completely still. He drew another careful breath before speaking again, every word clear despite the weakness in his voice. "Find Claire Whitmore. Before anyone else enters this room, bring her back to me." News of the king's awakening spread through Blackwood Keep before the morning bells finished ringing. Noble families hurried into the great hall wearing expressions of relief and anticipation. Generals arrived prepared to discuss military affairs. Advisors carried stacks of official documents waiting for the king's signature. Everyone believed the first royal audience after nearly a year would determine the future of the kingdom. Instead, Adrian Blackwood entered the hall with calm, measured steps and ignored every prepared speech. His strength had not fully returned, yet the quiet certainty in his silver eyes silenced the room more effectively than any command ever could. Dr. Edmund remained beside him, while members of the Royal Council bowed respectfully. One advisor stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we thank the moon for your recovery. The kingdom has waited many months for this day." Adrian acknowledged him with a slight nod before asking only one question. "Has Claire Whitmore been found?" The hall fell into uneasy silence. Another official cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, she returned to her family's cottage yesterday afternoon. We have already sent riders." Adrian lowered his gaze for a brief moment before looking back at the assembled court. "Good. Several confused glances passed between the nobles. One finally spoke with careful hesitation. "Your Majesty, there are urgent matters requiring your attention." Adrian answered quietly. "There is nothing more urgent." Before anyone could respond, his eyes rested upon the faded blue ribbon tied around the small flower vase that Dr. Edmund had quietly placed beside the royal chair before the meeting began. He smiled almost imperceptibly. "For nearly 1 year," he began, "many people believed I heard nothing. The room remained perfectly still. You believed I slept through every sunrise." He paused before continuing. "I did not." A wave of astonishment swept across the gathered nobles. Adrian spoke again, his voice steady. "Every morning she greeted me with the same words. Good morning. The rain finally reached the rose garden today. I think the flowers will survive after all." Dr. Edmund slowly lifted his head in surprise. Adrian continued, without hesitation. "She once said, 'You missed another season. The maple trees outside your window are turning bright red. I wish you could see them.'" Several attendants exchanged stunned expressions. Those sentences had never been written in any report. Adrian took another slow breath. "She told me, I wonder if people remember kindness. Everyone remembers victories and failures, but kindness disappears so easily." His gaze moved across the silent hall. "She also said, no crown should carry every burden alone. Even kings deserve someone who simply stays." No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. The advisors who had dismissed Claire's quiet conversations now stared at one another in disbelief. Adrian's memory did not falter for a single word. Every sentence returned exactly as she had spoken it, carrying the same warmth that had reached him through the darkness. Finally, his voice softened. "On her last day, she told me, you were loved long before you opened your eyes." He closed his eyes briefly, hearing her voice once more exactly as it had sounded. When he opened them again, they were filled not with sorrow but with certainty. "Those words carried me farther than any medicine. While all of you waited for me to wake, she gave me a reason to find my way back." No one in the great hall could answer him, because for the first time they understood that the forgotten Omega they had barely noticed had never been speaking into silence. Every quiet story, every hopeful laugh, every ordinary memory had been heard, remembered, and treasured by the king they believed had known nothing at all. Before the sun reached its highest point, Adrian Blackwood ordered every report connected to his long recovery brought into the royal study. The room filled with journals, physician notes, attendance records, and schedules documenting nearly a year of palace life. He read every page with unwavering focus. Again and again, one name appeared only in the smallest entries, almost as an afterthought. Claire Whitmore. She arrived before dawn. Claire Whitmore changed the bandages. Claire Whitmore remained after everyone else departed. Nothing in those records reflected the countless stories she had shared or the hope she had quietly carried into the room each morning. When Dr. Edmund entered, Adrian looked up calmly. "Tell me everything that was never written." The elderly physician hesitated only briefly. He explained how Claire had continued caring for the king after celebrated healers had given up. He admitted that many members of the court believed her conversations were pointless, yet she had never answered ridicule with resentment. She accepted every difficult task without complaint and never once asked for recognition or reward. Adrian listened without interruption, but the quiet disappointment in his eyes grew deeper with every sentence. "How many people thanked her?" he finally asked. Dr. Edmund lowered his gaze. "Very few, Your Majesty." Adrian stood and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens Claire had described so many times. The roses were blooming exactly as she had promised. "Kindness should never become invisible," he said softly. That afternoon, the royal court assembled once more. This time Adrian carried no reports. Instead, he addressed every noble, advisor, and officer gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling. "For nearly 1 year," he began, "many among you walked past a woman who expected nothing except the opportunity to help another person. Some dismissed her. Some overlooked her. Most never even learned her name." His voice remained calm, yet every word settled heavily across the silent hall. A kingdom does not become great because it celebrates only those who stand in the brightest light. It becomes great when it honors those who quietly keep that light alive for others. Several advisors shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own careless remarks. Adrian continued, "Beginning today, every healer, servant, and attendant who faithfully serves this palace will receive the same respect owed to every honorable member of this court. Gratitude will no longer depend upon rank." No one objected. They could not. The king had spoken without anger, but with undeniable conviction. When the audience ended, Adrian gave one final instruction to the captain of the royal guard. "Prepare a carriage, but leave the royal banners behind. We are not traveling to impress anyone." The captain looked surprised. "Your Majesty, shall I assemble an escort?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Only enough people to ensure a comfortable journey. We are visiting someone who has already given this kingdom more than enough." As preparations quietly began, Claire spent the afternoon at her family's small cottage arranging wildflowers in simple clay jars beside the porch. She believed her chapter at the palace had ended forever. She smiled as neighbors stopped to greet her, never imagining that beyond the distant hills, the king whose silence she had filled with gentle stories was already making only one journey that truly mattered. This time, he was not searching for a healer. He was searching for the woman whose quiet compassion had led him all the way home. The royal carriage stopped quietly before the small white cottage just as the evening sun painted the fields in soft shades of gold. There were no trumpets, no banners, and no grand announcement. Claire Whitmore looked up from the garden where she had been watering wildflowers, certain the visitors had lost their way. When the carriage door opened, her breath caught. Adrian Blackwood stepped onto the narrow stone path, no longer dressed as a patient hidden beneath blankets, but as the Alpha King she had only known through portraits and whispered stories. Even wearing the simple dark coat he had chosen instead of ceremonial robes, there was an unmistakable calm strength about him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Claire lowered her eyes respectfully and bowed. "Your Majesty." Adrian smiled gently. "Claire." She slowly looked up, surprised that he had spoken her name with such familiarity. "I am relieved to see you have recovered," she said honestly. "The kingdom has been praying for your health." Adrian took a few unhurried steps closer until they stood beside the small garden she had planted herself. White lilies bloomed beside blue wildflowers, almost identical to the arrangements she had once placed beside his bed. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. Claire looked confused. "My promise." He nodded toward the flowers. "You told me the roses would bloom again. You told me spring would return even if I could not see it. You told me no crown should carry every burden alone. You told me kindness was remembered even when people forgot to say thank you." Claire stared at him, unable to speak. Adrian's silver eyes held only warmth. "I remember every sunrise you described. Every story about the baker who burned the apple pies. Every robin that built its nest beneath the eastern roof. Every snowfall. Every season. Every hopeful laugh when you believed you were speaking to silence." Tears slowly gathered in Claire's eyes as the impossible truth settled over her. "You heard me?" Adrian nodded. "Every single day." His voice softened. "When I could not move, your words became my mornings. When I could not open my eyes, you described a world worth returning to. When I feared I had been forgotten, you reminded me that I was never alone." Claire covered her mouth with trembling fingers, remembering every quiet conversation she had believed disappeared into an empty room. "I never expected you to remember any of it," she whispered. Adrian smiled. "I remembered all of it because every word carried hope." He reached into his coat and carefully unfolded the faded blue ribbon she had tied around the flower vase on her final day. "I asked them to leave everything exactly as you left it." Claire recognized the ribbon instantly, and a gentle laugh escaped through her tears. Adrian continued, "A kingdom can reward loyal service with titles or gold, but neither could repay what you gave me. You returned something far more valuable than my strength. You returned my reason to live." He offered her the ribbon, and when she accepted it, their hands met for only a quiet moment beneath the warm evening light. "Claire Whitmore," he said with calm certainty, "if you are willing, I would like you to walk beside me from this day forward, not because you healed your king, but because you saw the man long before anyone else believed he would ever stand again." Claire smiled through grateful tears and gave the smallest nod. Around them the evening breeze carried the fragrance of blooming flowers across the peaceful garden, and for the first time the future they had unknowingly built through a year of quiet conversations no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to two hearts that had already found one another long before they ever met face to face.